Hi everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Mastering the Intangibles of Great Leadership, hosted by HRDQ-U and presented by Dr. William Seidman and Rick Grbavac. Today's webinar will last around 1 hour. If you have any questions, you can always type them into the questions box. We'll be answering these questions as they come in live at the end of the presentation or as they follow up by email if we do happen to run out of time. My name is Sarah Schaefer, and I will moderate today's webinar. Dr. William Seidman is the CEO of Grbavac Incorporated, a company focusing on creating high-performing organizational cultures. He has worked as a manager or consultant with many large and small organizations, including Hewlett-Packard, Jack in the Box, Intel, Tektronix, CVS Pharmacy, and Sears. Rick joined Grbavac as Vice President in 2002. Since that time, he has worked with a wide variety of clients, including Fortune 100 companies in the retailing, financial, high-tech, construction, manufacturing, and health sectors. Welcome and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you very much for having us here. A special thanks to Sarah for all the great work you've done at HRDQ for sponsoring it, and welcome to everybody else who's on the call. To build on what Sarah said about questions, we're certainly going to pause at the end for questions, but we're going to pause a couple times during the webinar. So if some question comes to your mind in process, please log it, and a couple breaks during the webinar, we'll try to answer them going forward. Today we're going to talk about the work we have done that focuses on the intangibles of leadership. And we're going to talk a little bit about how we discovered those and what the underlying process was, because it's really different from what you see supporting most leadership books and methodologies. And we're also going to then talk about the specific 7 intangibles that emerge from this process. And finally, we're going to talk about the methodology that we developed so that we had very, very high impact leadership programs where you had many, many people then displaying these intangibles of great leadership. So a little background on how we came to this. We actually were founded in a conference room at Intel 17 years ago. And the specific problem that Intel had is they were doing a very large project. It was called the Merced, and they were struggling a little bit. It was very complex. There were about 650 people working on it, and they asked us to come in as consultants to examine what was going on with the project. And what we discovered was that they had 6 guru chip designers who were incredibly overloaded, and there were about 640 other people sitting around and waiting for the 6. And they said to us, we'd like you to reverse engineer what makes these 6 so extraordinary and figure out a methodology for it to get dispersed out to others so we don't have this bottleneck as we're going forward. And we said, okay, we're interested in pursuing it, and they then put an interesting caveat. They said to us, you know, Bill, Rick, we like you as people, but we actually don't like consultants. So you can't do this in standard consulting way. We love methodologies, we love processes, we love software. So we want you to create a robust, repeatable methodology, ideally grounded in software, that allows us to reverse engineer what makes somebody extraordinary and to distribute the content. And so that was the charge they gave us. And as we started to dig into this, we found out that there was very little literature on what made somebody truly a star performer. And so we kind of had to invent a process for reverse engineering them, and that took us 2.5 years. And it then took much longer to invent a process, another 5 years, where you could take that knowledge and distribute it to people in a very consistent and robust way. And it was really the development of MRI-based images about learning and PET scans on how people process information that led us to develop a learning methodology where we could launch a learning program for leaders and have this tremendous buy-in and tremendous energy and have this guided practice where people would actually practice the attitudes and behaviors for a number of months until it became very deeply internalized. And this then proliferated out through multiple roles in organizations, from individual contributors who were customer service reps and call centers on phones, to middle managers and first-line supervisors, to executives, senior managers who are being groomed for executive responsibility, executives being developed for greater strategic responsibilities. It was done in many, many diverse roles and then across many, many different industries. High-tech, fast food, many types of insurance, healthcare, consulting. And so it really started to develop this very diverse kind of and deep foundation for what we started to see, these patterns of the intangibles of leadership. And when we talked about it, it was leadership certainly in the formal sense of the org chart for senior manager, but it was also leadership at every level of the organization, including highly influential individual contributors, and followed the same kind of patterns. Now, there's the typical question for human resource and learning folks is it measurable? Does it have an impact? And part of my doctoral work at Stanford was in an area where that helped me understand how to measure these attitudes and behaviors. And so we were able to apply this. And so as we talk about this, an important element is, number one, it can be measured. And number two, the results are really quite staggeringly phenomenal, much more than we'd seen previously. Typically in formal and informal certification programs, 90 to 95% of the people demonstrate the attitudes and behaviors of the stars. It means they're actually demonstrating these leadership intangibles. Where we could correlate to business outcome measures, the average return on investment was 20x. That's not 20%, that's 20 times. The measured high in a very experimentally kind of pure controlled environment with test groups and multiple control groups was 39 times. So we're talking about very, very substantive measured impacts on the performance of the organization. And so it's this deep foundation, these deep kind of results that we're going to now share with you what we found as we were going through the program. Oops, sorry. Rick?
Okay. Hi, I'm Rick Grbavac. So how did we find these intangibles? So these intangibles came out as a result of actually digging into the wisdom and knowledge of the top performers in organizations. So the first thing you have to do is identify who these people are. And what we came to after multiple kinds of ways to find top performers in organizations, it actually came down to something as simple as this. There is a respect criteria in organizations. There are people that are respected for some or all of their abilities in any given role. And when you ask people, who are those people that are most respected for what they do in the organization, they can come up with that list. I mean, think about it in your own organization. Who are the people most respected for what they do? And you'll come up with a very short list, and I think if you ask around, other people come up with that same list. And we've tested that doing other kinds of statistical analysis on performance, etc. And it usually comes down to this kind of a list of people that have this secret sauce, so to speak. So first thing is discover the star performers, and then you need to discover their wisdom. It's more than just their knowledge. If it was just their knowledge, then we could all just make a nice checklist of all the things that they need to do and hand it to everybody and say, here, do this list and you'll be great. But it's more than that. It's really taps into their passion for their higher purpose for what they do. And it's in that passion that people actually do different things. And the discovery methodology that we use, we actually role play in that methodology, a person in that position but just lacking the things in order to be great. So we actually talk about what does it take to be great in the role. We capture that higher purpose, we capture the operational excellence, and the combination of those two things actually comes together, and when we organize that content in a way that people actually think and can absorb, in 3 days we can capture all of their expertise and passion for what they do. And this is the discovery process, and it takes more than a couple of minutes to talk about it, but in any given leadership role, in any industry, any country we've ever done this in, we end up capturing that wisdom of that star group, star performers. And they seem to organize their thoughts and ideas in a certain way. And it's all very consistent. And because of that, we come up with this secret sauce of the star performers. And so what that allowed us to do is it allowed us to observe some qualities, some of these intangibles of the people across 17 years of doing this. And so across 17 years of talking to top performers, we see a couple of things that they all do. They all have this kind of quality. They own their own learning, meaning they take responsibility for it, and they also use reflection. And I know that in the literature out there, there's a lot of talk about reflective learning. We're going to talk about each one of these things separately. So the two tangibles we observed. The first one, star leaders own their own learning. They're very proactive and inquisitive. They take responsibility for learning things and sharing it with others. And they, it's funny, but they integrate this idea of learning with the process of leading people. That's an interesting concept when you think about it. They don't wait for somebody else to tell them what they need to know. And we've run across numerous people in leadership roles that are waiting around for other people to tell them what to do. And I know in the learning organization, HR organizations, a lot of times you are in fact telling people what they need to know. Well, great leaders don't wait. Great leaders step out of the box and go out and find out what they need to know. So, and the other part is they keep learning as part of this. Now think about your own organization. What would happen if everyone in the organization took responsibility for learning a little bit each day and then sharing it with others? What kind of organization would you have? That's what we see in star leaders. So that's number one. They own their own learning. Number two is that they use reflection. Now, they not only gain power from this, but I think more importantly, they gain confidence. And this is actually a little different than mindfulness. And I think if you've all been reading a lot of stuff about mindfulness lately in blogs and journal articles and stuff, this is very different. This is actually thinking about, is reflecting on what they did during the day, what they learned during the day, and what we've found is it's very powerful when people write stuff down. So if they spend just 5 minutes a day writing down what happened during the day, what they learned, how they might improve things, 5 minutes a day, the research shows that you gain an hour's worth of productivity. So it's a formal allocation of time to reflect. And these great leaders, they focus on what they're learning. And I think in any training kind of program, if you've ever had a really successful one, it's where people took time at the end of that process and reflected on what they just learned and how they were going to apply it. And boy, when you get people to start doing that and start reflecting on it, that's when reflection really becomes a powerful tool for any leader. So those are the two, and it's really the foundation for all these aspects of leadership. Taking responsibility for learning things and then reflecting on how it can improve things in their work life. Those are the two things we observed. Now, Bill's going to talk about the 5 other intangibles that that the great leaders told us about. And so, Bill, why don't you carry on with that?
This is one of the places we're going to pause for questions. So if you have questions, now is the time to log them in. There was a question in here that came in. Are there other intangibles? And the answer is, yeah, we're going to be doing 5 more. I want to emphasize a couple things about this before we move on. First of all, the next set of intangibles we're going to talk about are actually things that people describe to us. They basically describe their own sense of greatness in the discovery process. These 2 are things that we observed that they were kind of unconsciously competent. This is how they were behaving, and they got to their more articulated information because they did own their learning, because they were very reflective and thoughtful about their process. And one of the questions that we often get in this moment is, well, can you teach people these things? And we're going to get a little bit into how we teach it later on, but the answer is absolutely. One of the bigger things that we get engaged with is people are so educated to be passive in their learning, to sit at the back of the class and look at the PowerPoint slides and decide whether they want to pay attention to it. And they're so pressured by daily pressures to not be reflective and things like that, that we have to consciously set out to teach people these capabilities. But once they do own their learning, once they really start to think in terms of this notion of reflection, literally the essence of working smarter rather than just harder, they don't go back, and they have this just burst of neurochemicals, they have a burst of energy, and it's really quite powerful. We kind of call it, as Rick said before, it is a fusion of learning and leading. In order to be a great leader, you got to be a great learner. And so that's part of what we focus in on. Rick, are there some questions that we want to address that came in here?
Yeah, I'm trying to read them here. They're a little truncated. Why don't you go ahead and let me dig up some of these questions so that I can see them?
Sure. Okay, so going beyond just what we observed, we ran discovery sessions for probably over the years, thousands of people who were designated as star performers in the roles. And stars isn't just metrics. It is that they achieve business outcomes, but in a way that's consistent with the best values of the company. So this isn't star in the celebrity sense. This is star in the deeply grounded, sort of intrinsic quality sense. And as we asked them to coach us, they followed this very, very consistent pattern of, they said, focus here, focus there. So what comes out is they were passionately committed to a greater purpose. They were all about creating a greater social good. If you're familiar with Dan Pink's work on motivation and drive, this is his notion of purpose as a primary motivator, and these people displayed it. And as an example, we work, for instance, with a pharmacy chain where the top performing pharmacy managers thought of themselves, and this is their words, as a critical part of the family emergency response system. So they were all about helping families in distress. Everybody else was about doing 120 prescriptions a day. So everybody else was very transactional, very narrowly focused. The star performers were very broadly focused on this intangibles of having this greater purpose that they were trying to achieve. And now here's an interesting and important part for human resource organizations, is that those people who were much more transformational in their thinking, the stars, far outperformed the more transactional people on the transactional metrics. So it's almost counterintuitive that you would go ahead and focus on the larger picture, focus on creating transformation, but the result of that was actually being better than the narrowly focused on meeting the metrics. So the driving force of this was the sense of passionate commitment to purpose. The next thing they did is they built consensus around the purpose. They were very conscious that they were operating in a highly connected world and that it was a kind of together we're better mentality, where they would very consciously and very systematically work to engage others in participation in the purpose. And we'll get a little bit into this later on, but one of the things they were actually doing by engaging people in this purpose is creating certain types of neural engagement, where they actually would cause what's called a dopamine squirt, because people saw themselves as contributing to this greater good. And in this greater good, it turns out they started to become very reflective and started to display some of these other behaviors. So they built this broad consensus around the purpose. And by the way, it was built in the messy real world. And what I mean by that is people had different agendas, people had budget constraints, people were under incredible time pressures, and yet they very much focused on getting everybody aligned so people were very successful and effective that way. The next thing they did is a step that is odd in that it sort of has two flavors to it. They really focused on how to get ready to execute. We found the less effective leaders would often jump to execution, that they would do a ready, fire, aim, and they would just plunge into stuff, and they really weren't prepared to execute. They didn't have the infrastructure of purpose-driven behaviors. We also had some people who would kind of skip in this step and just say, oh, we're all aligned on purpose, let's just go do stuff. And what you found the star performers doing is they took the time to plan. They took the time to be thoughtful. They would calibrate their planning to the nature of the direction they wanted to go and to the nature of their purpose. So sometimes they would do very thorough planning. Sometimes they would do back of the napkin planning. But there was no question that they did a very conscious purpose process in preparing people to be thoughtful about execution and preparing the skills, the alignment, all that stuff to thoroughly execute what they were planning to do. And they, by the way, they did these in sequence every time they went through the cycle of basically driving a new set of initiative and a new set of energy through the organization. So start with passion, build consensus, and then prepare to execute. And then, interesting enough, they would almost decouple from the more immediate tangible events, and they would look at it at change and performance improvement from a cultural perspective. They would say, how do we actually build the deeper value that is change resilient? Let's say resilience was one of the big things they talked about a lot, both for themselves personally and for their organization. How do we get everybody seeing change as opportunity rather than as a burden? How do we build a highly collaborative environment even though we're highly organized by silos? And they started to look at these deeper elements of the world around them and very consciously set out to create an environment where people felt empowered, where there was a sense of prosperity, where they were aligned with the purpose, and were thinking in, again, much more strategic, much more broad terms than the purely, well, what do we actually get done today? But then they actually did bring it to the, let's bring it all together, let's get it done today, and they started to think and act in what we came to call a flow state. Some of you may know the work of this psychologist whose name is absolutely unpronounceable. It's a Czech name that's like, 35 characters long, but basically he's done a lot of work on the notion of flow. In athletics, it's called being in the zone. And what we saw happening was these star leaders would do this kind of background work of the first 4 steps, and it created such a rich context to them that they were unconsciously competent in the way they led their organization. And through that unconscious competence, it was just fluid, it was easy. And they, in their organizations, would say things like that, oh, this is just so easy, we're just making it happen. And they had this just incredible release of energy, and they felt great. And coming out of that, they would then start the cycle again with some new level of capability. So these are the actual observed behaviors and impacts that we saw from the stars to become just these astounding leaders. And when we actually then tried to research, does this exist in the literature in general? There are bits and pieces of it. There's a book on execution that's pretty good. There's a lot of stuff on culture. There's stuff on the flow state. But this was the only place we found, and it was actually their description of what constituted just being extraordinary as leaders, whether it's leadership as an individual contributor in a technical role or leadership as the CEO on the org chart. So these are the intangibles. Yeah, so I'm going to pause here. Rick, you got some questions?
Yeah.
And we'll talk about these things, and then we'll plunge into each of these.
Sure. Before we get into each one of these things, Stephanie sends a question. So what do you do when you don't know what you don't know as a new leader?
When you say that?
No. What you don't know.
Okay, so so this is great. The one of the things that that we find happening with the leaders is because they follow this process, they are very comfortable with themselves and confident of themselves, and they see this as important for what they came to call the messy real world. The messy real world doesn't have certainty. It doesn't have complete information. It has conflict. It has all these things. Now, it turned out that the foundation for this confidence was owning your own learning and reflection. So they would just assume that they didn't know everything. Interesting enough, by the way, these folks were incredibly humble. This is not the egotism of sort of celebrity stars. This is people saying, hey, I don't know what I know, but I'm confident that I can learn it. I'm confident that if we build a transformative culture, everybody can learn it. I'm confident that if we have a compelling collective purpose, we will do the things necessary to build mastery to be successful. And so, interestingly enough, the star leaders really do start from the perspective of they don't know much at all. And they're very humble about it, and they say, so what are the processes we need to go through for individually and collectively to know more? And so the fact that they don't know anything, they actually turn into an opportunity and strength. So, and it's always based on the messy real world. Rick, do you want to add anything to that? Or?
No, I really like Matt's comments. Get a coach, get a mentor, read, network.
Okay, so we're gonna go beyond that though, because we're gonna say, hey, look, there's all sorts of problems with mentoring. There's all sorts of problems with traditional views of coaching, reading, but we're gonna put this into much more of a structured process that says, hey, look, you can actually follow what we did and kind of reverse engineer the STAR pattern, and you can create very, very proactive programs where you can lead people into all of these things really rather rapidly. I mean, a typical program we run runs 4 to 5 months, and at the end of it, everybody is displaying all 7 of these intangibles, the 2 that we observed plus the 5 that they articulate. So it's far more structured and proactive, and it's also, by the way, scientific. It's really based on deep science that has come out of the MRIs and PET scans about how our brains actually process these intangibles, including things like uncertainty and purpose-driven behaviors and so on. So appreciate it, but we're going to even go beyond that. Leverage those things, but do more. Rick, you want to?
No,
I think do another one. Pick another one.
In deference to the time, let's keep moving on so we can handle a few more questions later.
Okay, good. So, so the first one is passionate purpose, and I mentioned that this is about creating a greater social good, and that greater social good can be for your immediate teammate, for your organization, for your company, for society. It can be defined in lots of different ways, but it is always about making the other more successful. And it is that in a sense, and it is very humble, it is very giving, and it is just a tremendously powerful feeling when you're in that space. But it must be authentic, and this is also where it ties into the notion of reflection. People sense in an instant whether you're authentic or you're just going through the motions. And the way you get to be authentic is you do the self-awareness, you do the reflection that enables you to think, hey, this is something that's just incredibly important to me personally, incredibly important to the organization, and you create this sense of greater good. So you start to see how the observed behaviors and the specific definition of purpose come together. And you have the correct mental model of self and the business. Literally, you think about the business correctly, you think about the environment correctly. And an element of this is you start to write all this down, because the act of writing forces you to be much more specific and much more complete in how you do it. And you develop confidence then about your ability to make judgments. To go back to that question about uncertainty and not knowing what you don't know. Because you have done reflection, because you have thought about, am I thinking about this correctly? Do I have the right model of myself, right model of what our business is? People develop the confidence for making good business judgment, but there is a homework element. I mean, you do have to study, for instance, your market. You have to study your strategy. You have to study your colleagues. You have to study your competition. You have to look at disruptive trends in the market. I mean, for instance, we're working in healthcare a lot right now, and the disruption in the market is astounding. We work in technology. Disruption is astounding, and most of that disruption is coming from unexpected alternative sources. And so you have to be looking at the world of the messiness of this uncertainty and doing your homework about it, and then synthesizing all this into, here's the greater good we're going to try to create. So the first part is purpose. Well, once you have purpose, you then actually have something meaningful to talk to people about. And so you consciously and systematically start to build a mutually beneficial network. And when I say mutually beneficial, I mean that people perceive that you are adding value to their lives, and in turn they're adding value to your life in what you're doing. And so one of the exercises, for instance, they do is they actually sit, stars do is they sit and they say, well, how do I add value to a network? What are the things that I could contribute to others? How could I make their lives better? And they designate basically hubs and networks that they are going to proactively and consciously contact. And they then have discussions, and there's an interesting balancing act here between when is somebody in the role a driver of a purpose versus when is somebody a listener and responsive. And these star leaders in their intangibles know when to be proactive and pushy and when to be responsive and supportive. And through these processes and managing these things, they start to build this collective strength. It's literally everybody pulling on the rope in the same direction. And from this, you get this profound sense of alignment where hidden agendas drop away, resource conflicts are minimized. You just have this sense of sort of collective wellness that drives people forward. So we now have two things, and you can see that they start to build on it. Purpose drives your ability to interact with and build alignment and consensus for your network, and that then creates the resource allocation, the commitment that is necessary. So then it's a fairly small step for these folks to move into, okay, how do we make this meaningful? How do we actually prepare ourselves to execute in a way? And there are some well-known basics. There is, getting up the right amount of planning. There is managing the resource allocation, which is almost always where you get into the big rub, where people say, hey, yeah, we're all for your purpose, we really support it, we're aligned, and you say to them, okay, I need 3 full-time equivalents to work on this from your organization, and they say, well, I didn't think you actually meant give me resources. And so part of what they do is the messy real world comes into play, and they actually get to the point where they have allocated focused resources that are aligned on trying to do the work required to create the greater purpose. So this one's very much more tangible and pragmatic. The people who are very much analytics in their sort of learning style tend to like to jump to this step and jump the first couple steps. Those who are very emotionally driven and sort of broadly strategic, they don't like this step in general, but the real star performers do this all, and again, you can teach it all going forward. The fourth step is getting into the culture, and the thing that really is important here is they recognize that this deeper notion of culture, which, as you know, is a very abstract notion, really does drive performance. And there's all sorts of literature about that. When we actually talk to most managers, they don't know. They say, what are you talking about here? And what it means is that they think about what are our values, what are our motivations, how are we aligned, how are we working, how do we make this a great place to work? And they proactively set out to change themselves. One of the key things that we see is, as part of the self-directed learning, is they model the cultural transformation. I mean, one of the questions that Rick loves to ask folks is, he says to people, how are you going to lead differently in order to lead change? And most of the time they give them this look of, what are you talking about? The star leaders recognize that change, performance improvement, great leadership starts with themselves as the role model, and they function and act that way. So they model these transformational behaviors, they think culture, they think depth, and they really work to share not just the collective purpose, but to build a collective sense on how it's going to be accomplished. And they really do focus in on how are we going to get this done, and get everybody to think about how we're going to get this done. So this is now, oddly enough, coming back to some of the earlier things that are less tangible, but between preparing for execution and preparing sort of this deep ability to execute through the culture, they move it to a whole different level. And finally, all this comes together in the state of flow. And here's a definition of what flow is. Many of you probably have experienced flow in different ways. And what it does is it has this deep sense of rhythm, this just profound confidence in the face of uncertainty, this ongoing self-awareness, and it's just based on doing the personal development work, doing the personal homework that puts you in this state of flow, puts your organization in this state of flow, and then you see this just sort of massive improvement in the productivity and effectiveness of the organization. So again, I've never seen this particularly described in terms of how you got to this, but this has a tremendous amount of power to it. Rick, I see we have many more questions. You want to have a few questions here?
Here's one from Randy, and he was asking about identifying the these top performers, and it's kind of an interesting idea. It's, you know, by whose standards, and, you know, what are the leading characteristics of these top performers in an organization, and, you know, why are they respected? That's a good question.
So the respect is always within a cultural context, and it doesn't particularly jump boundaries in organizations. So it's within that context, and so we say to people like the senior management team, who are the people you most respect for a particular function? But let's say you have, to go back to the very first question, you have tremendous uncertainty. You're entering a new market, or there's tremendous amount of disruption in the market. The notion of respect then goes to the criteria of who are the people we most respect for their ability to accommodate disruptive change, or who are the people we most respect for their insights into the disruption in the market. And so you then look at it in the context of where you want your organization to go. And there is, we thought there would be a certain bias towards people picking their friends, but it turned out that these highly respected people are almost universally respected. They're respected by their peers, they're respected by people who report to them. They're almost mythological in in the way they are seen, because again, it isn't just driving the metrics, it's that they exemplify the best in people and the best in organization. And you just don't find that people who are nasty or curmudgeons, they just aren't respected, and so they just never get nominated. And again, sorry,
yeah,
sure.
The other thing that comes to mind is it's rare that any one person has all of the qualities that you're looking for. So what you try to get when you pull together a group to do this wisdom discovery is you want people that exemplify some or many of the qualities that you're looking for, and then the process of having them talk about their greatness, they come to consensus on what the best known way to be great is. And what we find is that every wisdom discovery we've ever done is that the people in the wisdom discovery increase their own abilities by 10 or 20% because it either reawakened things that they had forgotten about, or it actually sparked them to think about new ways to be great. So
some of these intangibles, it seems to be built on the notion of extroversion. What about introverts? And we were actually very concerned about that when we first got into it, and we found out that that actually wasn't an important variable. To the degree to which somebody was an extrovert or an introvert was more about an information processing style, where people would either take information in and kind of process it internally and then speak, versus somebody who kind of thought out loud. So we'd find that in the reflection stage, people would sometimes reflect internally, sometimes reflect externally. But when it came to, for instance, building a sense of purpose, no difference. When it came to building a network, no difference. The fact that somebody was an introvert meant that they would go into these sessions typically more highly processed than the extrovert. And that was fine. It produced the same results. So, you know, this was actually something we tested for and we were very concerned about, but it turned out to be an absolute non-issue. This is independent of those characteristics. And let me say too, for those of you who might be in multinationals, it is independent of culture. It is independent of language. This type of stuff has come from Japan. The notion of self-respect in Japan reflection took an interesting wrinkle where they said their recommendation was that every senior manager spend a day in a Buddhist temple meditating. We didn't see that translating very clearly into the U.S. culture, but so you start to see that it is actually about the best in us as humans, as leaders. The neuroscience supports it. This is where kind of mindfulness has come into play. Other research supports it, and again, we've done this in many different countries with many different operating language, and we get the same patterns. So Rick, we're at about quarter of. Why don't you go on and let's finish up sort of the discussion about how do you actually convert this into a program to develop people, and then we'll try to answer a few more questions.
Sure. So the question is, do you really want many great leaders in the organization? Many organizations focus on hypos. If you've read some of our articles that are out there about hypos, and we tend to think that the organization is better if you have more great leaders at every level of the organization, and that's from individual contributors all the way to the top. And the science now creates this opportunity so that we can actually get these kinds of intangibles into many, many people in the organization at all different levels. It's going to be a better organization as a result. So the idea of focusing your attentions on a select few to become the leaders of an organization is very limiting. And those great leaders will always come to the top of a larger pool, but let's take the larger pool and move them into having great leadership qualities. So to do that, to create this deep bench, if you start with the STARS wisdom, and you can combine it with the latest in how people think and learn to get them to open up the door so they aren't rejecting. I know one of the questions had talked about telling people stuff. Well, this isn't about telling people stuff. This is about engaging people so that they want to learn what the top people are doing. And you need a learning platform to kind of hold this together so that people have a place to reflect and you can see their reflections. The social learning processes, this is where you're opening up the door with things like fair process. Again, this is another whole discussion at another time, but there's it's group learning. These are things that we have kind of tapped into. Motivation science, the practical application of learning, being reflective learners, and the ability to scale this. You can create this practical, guided, we actually call it a practicum approach. And when you do this, when you put these four kinds of things together, you can actually get a very sustained and predictable change in your organization that sticks. It's not a two-day seminar. It requires time and practice. It's a drip methodology versus a fire hose methodology. And you guys know what I'm talking about. The drip methodology allows people to actually become great. So this is, Bill's always kidding me about my rant about competent versus greatness. Do you want people that are competent, or do you want people working to be great? I personally want people working for me that want to be great leaders. You can change the conversation. You can change the language by focusing on greatness. And many organizations, in fact, all organizations today, you can't afford to be average. We need people working to be great. And that's what they're facing conditions today that require great leadership. So the focus on these intangibles are the things that are going to make the difference between someone who's just average as a leader and someone who is truly great. And that's where we're heading. So with that, Bill?
So again, almost all organizations are facing conditions that truly require great leadership right now. And what you have in front of you is an opportunity to build these intangibles to get it so that you just have this awesome organization going forward. And now I'm going to turn it back over to Sarah. And Sarah, you had some other questions you wanted to ask or to summarize it here?
All right, perfect. Yes, thank you so much. We do have some time for more of those questions. So attendees, just go ahead and submit those to us my way now. And while we wait for a little bit of those questions to come in, let me share a little bit on how to keep in touch. Bill and Rick's contact information is on that slide right there. So go ahead and connect with them after this session. And as always, you can connect with us, HRDQ-U, through our regular social media channels, and also to register for our weekly webinar Wednesdays, go to hrdqu.com. Okay, and we do have a number of questions coming in, so I'm going to go ahead and get started on the first one, and that one is coming from Dave. What makes this different from other leadership models?
I think there are a couple things that make it different. First of all, this is mostly how the star leaders describe themselves. So instead of it being really an external consultant who's looking at things, academic, theoretician saying it should be this way, this really derives from them. And while certainly bits and pieces of the whole thing are reflected in the general literature, we've never seen any place that pulled it all together in the way these folks do, and pulled it together in the perspective of that very first question about the uncertainty and the conditions and how you build things. And when you listen to them, there is this kind of gritty reality to it that is just very, very different from what we've seen in any other place. And I think the other part about it is, when we go in and talk to a lot of folks, one of the things we actually find is a very broad-based disillusionment with leadership programs. I mean, most of them will give you okay on smile sheets, but there's really relatively little sense that they have impact. And when people are then actually consciously focusing on these intangibles and doing the learning program in a way that is based on this newest neuroscience of learning and the social learning processes and so on, it is actually a visible, observable phenomenon that people change their attitudes and behaviors, and that the culture itself becomes highly and visibly energized. So I would say it's two things. One is, three things. It derives from the stars themselves, not from somebody external. Two is it's much more holistic in that all these things play together. And three is it actually produced substantive change, measurable change in the environment that other programs, we haven't seen any other programs to get anywhere similar to this in that impact.
All right, great, thank you. Our next question is coming from Michelle. Was there any form of reflection that was used more than any other form?
That's actually, I never really thought about the question that way, but I think well, so first of all, let's take a step back and think about what we mean or talking about by reflection. Reflection is really simply taking time out to be thoughtful. I think the question isn't that it's used more. People tended to just take time out. There's a lot of verbalization, a lot of inner talk and interaction as reflection. But our perception is that, well, that probably was used more. It was less impactful than literally taking time to think, literally putting a time in your schedule to be thoughtful. And also, in particular, writing down your thoughts. I mean, we know again from the neuroscience that the act of writing is much more demanding on the brain than talking, and that it suppresses portions of the brain associated with fear and resistance to change, and stimulates portions of the brain associated with sense of empowerment. So I would say that, and I'm talking a little bit off the top of my head here, and Rick, you can jump in on this, that verbalization is used most commonly, but is one of the weakest forms. Secondly, pure timeout is used to think. And third, the most powerful one is really writing down your thinking as you're doing it in some form of journal.
Yeah, and our approach actually trains people to be reflective, because we give them a stimulus, an activity. They go do that activity, then they are forced to sit back and think about, what did I learn from doing this activity and how can I apply it? And then they journal it, they write it down. So they get in a habit of seeing something, talking about it, discussing what they learned with others, writing it down. They actually get in this habit of being that kind of reflective. So it's a little more proactive reflection than it is when you just think about somebody sitting at a desk with their eyes gazing upward. It's not that. It's much more active in its approach.
It's about what you learned. I mean, we joke with people all the time. We go into a place and we'll say, hey, can anybody actually work harder? Is there a physical capability of working harder? And everybody said, no, we're working at the limits of what we can do. So your only alternative is to work smarter, right? And they say, yeah. But here's the paradox. In order to work smarter, you actually have to stop working harder for a little bit to be thoughtful, to reflect. So the first element of working smarter is a discipline of working smarter that says, I'm going to defer other things in the interests of working smarter. And people said, well, that's really kind of convoluted stuff, but they kind of get the idea that in order to be reflective, you've got to carve time out to be reflective. And as we can get into a little bit more, but what you think about matters. To focus in on what did I learn and how could I share what I learned, to focus in on what is my purpose and how can I get better at my purpose. The general view of mindfulness is just take time out from the pressures, and we don't really agree with that. We think that the stars were much more directed and proactive as how they applied reflection.
All right, perfect. Thank you. We probably just have time for one more question, and that one is coming from Allison. How did you measure the impact?
Okay, so my doctoral dissertation at Stanford was a study of how management training influenced the attitudes, cognitive patterns, and behavioral patterns of various people in different management roles. And in order to do that, I had to actually craft an instrument that would measure down to the single word or single action level in a statistically valid and reliable way attitudes and behaviors. And what we were able to do is to, first of all, take the description from the stars and use that instrument to actually measure whether other people were in fact behaving that way. And that became the basis for either formal observational guides where third parties would observe people, or less formal, let's say 360 surveys, where there was sort of round feedback on things, where you could actually quantitatively assess, and again in a statistically and legally reliable and valid way, whether people were demonstrating those attitudes and behaviors. In addition, in environments where you could actually get a decent outcome measure, which is hard, not many environments where we're really talking about leadership have good measures, but in places like sales environments and customer service environments and call centers, you could. We were able to run formal correlations of people progressing through the intangibles and basically building their skills against performance on the outcome measures. So this is pretty thoroughly documented, both in terms of a demonstration of capability and where possible in terms of outcome measures.
All right, great. Thank you. Those were some great questions. And we are out of time, but I know there are a few questions that we did not get to, so I'm going to go ahead and craft that email and send it over to Bill and Rick, and they will be more than happy to answer those. and then we will send those out probably about mid next week. So Bill and Rick, would you just like to add any final thoughts before I go ahead and wrap up the session then for today?
Rick, you want to go first?
I'm just pleased to be with you today. I hope you got something out of this presentation, and love to help anyone who needs help in this area.
And I would just conclude that, if you think about the intangibles around you and your own intangibles and what you could do to develop them, you'll find that this will give you just a personal opportunity to improve your life, improve the life of those around you, and I just strongly encourage you to seize it. And if you want to chat about that, we're here anytime. So have a great day, everybody.
All right,
Thanks.
great. All right, thank you so much again, guys. And again, we will receive those emailed responses probably mid next week. So we appreciate your time, and we hope you found today's webinar informative. Thank you.